1914 Serbian sterbien. After an IPA, I feel ready to try handling whatever my reviews sum up. Hey, we gotta do the usual. Now I gotta check. Looks good. Of this one. Now, obviously, I've become a little bit more willing to shut a game down, I think, before I'm completely through it. This one, the victory was decided, determined. But there was still as much interest for me as there probably should have been throughout the entire game towards the end. Why did I stop? Because it's a headache. Not a completely impossible headache. I've stopped a couple of games. I remember that Chosen game. I stopped because it was essentially such a headache it was unplayable. This is not. This is a playable game. It's a headache in sort of the sense that I felt about Vietnam, which is I just am not getting enough enjoyment out of it to justify the labor involved, mentally especially, in coping with it. I was also finding my fingers, I don't know if it's just age or whatever, but I was knocking counters over a lot more. It's small hexes, small counters. I'm used to dealing with that. Not huge stacks, so I don't really know, but gloss on gloss, which always has been a problem, especially since I started clipping. That's pretty standard for GMT, but it may be kind of a sign that stay away from the bigger GMT games. I don't know. At least for me. Of course, I have to face the same problem with gamers games, which also are glossy counters on glossy maps. I won't do that. I won't stop with them. But, it was another factor in it. So, the situation itself is not the most gripping. And speaking of gamer stuff, if I had, say, faced Reluctant Enemies as my first OCS game, I probably would have never bought another one. Now, I have Offensive Allowance, which is almost as interesting to me as Twilight in the East. I was kind of hoping to get a copy of that as well, but the fall sale crapped out on me. I went in too late, and honestly, I don't know if I'll ever get to it. I really don't, because this was not an absolutely miserable situation, but I don't know how long I have to go, and the games are coming in still at a rate where I don't know if I'm going to make it through them all. So anyway, and with this negative-ish experience, it's not horrible. It's hard to say, I can see where this would work and be a lot more interesting on another front. It would certainly be more interesting. The mountainous terrain, the limited choices, I didn't feel like I had a hell of a lot of opportunity to maneuver around. And certainly I should have more on either the East Front or the West Front in 1914. The system might sort of hold up in later years. There's some modifications, etc. The system itself is very detailed. It seems like the design decisions were to make the rules simpler at the cost maybe of more mechanical actions. And maybe the later rules are a little different. I know they've supposedly streamlined some of the stuff. My understanding is that's mainly in the combat tables where you need to print out new charts. And combat was one of the things that I actually really enjoyed the level of detail that came about through the game. Let's talk a little bit about components and then we'll get elsewhere. So the first interesting thing is you have these, for the Austrians, army cards, full card stock. And for the Serbs, you have core cards. You also have this resource tracks for both sides. And you have a single, I don't know, basically a core for the Austrians, but it is treated more like an army in that it consists of a core and some unaligned units. Not quite sure what the value of those unaligned units are, to tell you the truth. You might as well want them with the core, but core have a limitation to how many divisions you can have in them. So you would be able to attach a whole bunch of stuff to this army group without, without causing issues in terms of core size. Well, they're good quality pieces, but the functionality of them is perhaps the thing that I disliked most in the system. What they do in conjunction with you have army, some of these long things are for armies, some of them are for core boundaries. The core boundary ones don't really matter. They're just a mnemonic device to help you find your core on the map. These are the system of record for what belongs to what core. And what it means is you're regularly looking off the board and readjusting who's under what command, to a degree that is just far more than, say, a somewhat similar situation, which is the Zucker operational Napoleonic games, where you can move a division from one corps to another, or a brigade from one division to another. I don't remember the scale on them. I think it's actually division to brigade. It may depend on the game. But anyway, you can move your commands around and shift them, but there's no real driving reason to do so. And there they keep track of the strength of the units on those. They provide a hidden unit functionality, etc. In this game, there's not really a hidden unit functionality as far as I can see. There's the unit's condition is hidden. You're not allowed to paw through the stack to see what CER level it is, for example. You're not allowed to go look at the other players' little cards to see, to see how many strength points are off on the board, to see the CER level on here. But basically, you have information spread out in too many places, right? You have a few counters in the Zucker games on the map in general, in any given place. You don't have continuous fronts or anything like that, usually. So what you'll have is like one commander with other commanders under him, and they all have their specific units attached to their command. And it's all kind of traced off the map, and that's where all your information is. Here the information is split in two places, and that makes it more difficult to cope with to begin with. But the reason that these even exist, because you could have all the counters on the map, the reason these even exist is so that you can delineate which core a given unit is under. They're in different hexes. They're not collected in the same hex like they would be in the Zucker designs. This is important because you're allowed to intervene in various situations, and units of the same core can fight together. In fact, if units of the same core of different core in the same hex, or loose units with units of a core are in the same hex, they can't operate together at all. And there are a few cases in the game where that is actually really relevant and has a real effect on the game. But you spend a lot of time maintaining your state as to which core a particular unit is involved with in order to get a very little gain off that. And that's the case with a lot of the factors in this design, to tell you the truth. You're spending a lot of effort to get sort of some sort of pinnacle of realism, right? which theoretically is something that appeals to me. But the effort is so high for what you're getting that, at least in my case, I'm making more mistakes that cause that realism to melt below the level if this wasn't a part of the game at all. Okay. Counters themselves, standard GMT, kind of thinner stock counters, you know. They have their deluxe games that have the nice big thick counters and everything. And then they have these are war games that aren't going to have a huge popularity. They're not cheap. They're, you know, decent quality counters that you'd expect from most companies. They're just not your superb level of stuff. Each unit, well, each unit of brigade size or larger has an additional counter which goes on here. And again, this is like an expense. Like there's no sort of, hey, we're cutting corners by putting, you know, the strength points on a track or something like that, the way the Zucker games do. No, this is actually an additional expense where you have 2 functional counters per command, and one is to indicate which unit it's designated with. The other one is to designate where that unit exists on the map. And there's not necessarily a relationship between the two, but if there isn't, you've got problems. Your command is like misstructured and you're going to cause issues for yourself. You're not going to be able to draw supply, etc. So in terms of the actual game components, let's look what else is left. Turn record track, perfectly functional. The player aid cards, we'll talk about them in a little bit. The map, all right. It's a one-sheet map. It's a small campaign compared to the others. Offensive Outrance, I believe, has 5 maps that go together. I have no idea what Twilight in the East has. Probably even more. I found the terrain markings somewhat non-intuitive and difficult to follow. In particular, you have these different colors of mountain levels, which were hard to track. I found under my lighting, at least, the difference between foothills and rough, sometimes difficult with all the color that's there. I ended the game in part because one of these places where there's a bunch of roads going into like a little valley, well, the roads aren't really technically strictly necessary and would actually be kind of cluttersome if they were put in the valley. But the fact that they weren't there made it look to me like I was going through worse terrain than I was, and that I couldn't trace supply easily. And it left a big gap open in the Serbian lines. One which, you know, I would have said, screw it, I'll keep playing if other things hadn't been building up. And I was just finding myself having a really hard time coming up here and playing the game. In the same way that I did with Vietnam, where I'm like, well, I could easily see myself getting like a turn or 2 done a week, and I'm just never going to fucking get through it, and I'm not getting that much fun out of it. Might get more fun if I could focus and sit here and play it, but it's so exacting and exhausting to play it that I'm finding myself running away from it. Now, again, this may be age. I may not have the tolerance that I used to. The rule book is pretty good. Surprisingly so for a GMT game, actually. Lots of case numbers in here. Felt like there were reasonable references. The index was very useful. I found the organization good. I found myself forgetting little things. Making some mistakes where I made assumptions in the combat system having to do with the proficiency ratings, which, you know, I hold it to my own fault, as with most of the mistakes that I made in the game. But the way that the choices were made went against at least my intuitions and made me say, you know, maybe I wouldn't have made those mistakes as easily if some of the choices were made in a slightly different direction, or if there were less. There's not a lot of special cases in it. There's a fair amount, but for something that's this detailed, it's somewhat surprising um, that sort of a unified system could be pulled together that'll work pretty well. Especially since, and we'll get to this later, but it's got a kind of innovative, I mean, I think I've seen them before, interleaved sequence of play where one player moves, the other player gets a reaction move, one player combats, the other player gets a reaction combat. Now, they use different movement points. So in your regular move, you have a base movement allowance of 9, which sounds huge, but it's not. In your reaction move, you have a base movement allowance of 5, which allows you to bring your troops to the sound of the guns, as it were. All seems to work really nicely, but it does mean that there are some things where the rules have been simplified, but the mechanical tasks on the players have been made more difficult. And there's already a lot of mechanical pain in the game. One aspect is the combat system. It's an aspect that I like. And that brings us to the player aid sheet. You can see the combat results chart, very, very complex looking. It uses 2 dice, 1 die to determine which set of rows you're on, and another die to determine the specific row within that. You've got your odds chart, which works fairly normally. You have a mixture of defensive benefits, which combine between column shifts and strength point bonuses. And strength point bonuses are kind of weird because like a high mountain gives you 4 strength points, which if you've got a lot of troops there, is still meaningful. But if you're looking at small forces are really well capable of holding their own. I mean, you cannot dislodge a small force without a lot greater odds, because that small force is gaining such a significantly larger proportion of strength from it. Now, you're also not allowed to attack with very much in the mountains at all, and the defender's not allowed to defend with much. And that's some of the intricacies of the combat system, which, again, I think holds together really nicely if you can get the rules right. Like I said, they're not that complicated, but they're tricky. It's like they violate certain expectations that you have from earlier, maybe less well-designed games, but it's hard to get used to them. And again, that's part of the burden, is getting used to them. And part of that burden is part of what I'm shying away from when I walk away from the game and say, yeah, I don't really feel like facing it again. Because there's sort of this extra little leap I have to make, this extra neural jump that maybe if you played the shit out of this, you would end up just loving it. Let's take a look at the sequence of play. There's also a playbook, which gives the different scenario setups and some sample of play, not much. As noted during the playthrough, the game starts at like, I don't remember if it's turn 0 or turn -1 or something. What is it? Yeah, it starts on game turn 0 instead of game turn 1. And that's because action on this front started before. I thought it was maybe the grand campaign started later than one of the most basic scenario, but it's not. It's because the fighting started here before it started on the other fronts. So in order to, I don't know if you want to play them all at the same time. I'm not really sure there's a good way to link them all together, although certainly like the Second Army going up to the East Front and the movement of Hindenburg to the east, these things would make some sense if there was an interlocking campaign. So I can see a space for it. The game is clearly designed around 1914, though. You would basically need, like La Grande Guerre does, a different set of rules for 1915 on, and probably yet another set of rules for, 1918, if it came to that. And, yeah, but I think many of the core design elements could still work pretty well. You'd find artillery would change, though. So artillery in this particular period basically helps when you get a result on an enemy towards breaking them down more quickly. You're not seeing sort of a softening up initial firepower type thing like you would see in 1915, 1916. You're not seeing different choices of barrage types. You're not seeing gas and all that kind of stuff. So I would imagine that this system would get a lot more weighted down if it started moving into other years, the way that, say, Der Weltkrieg does. Now, Der Weltkrieg has its own problems. It's a fairly simple system, but it has its own fiddliness issue that I don't want to go into here. Yeah, let me take a look at the sequence of play. So it's an I go, you go, but again, it's got this interleaving. And it may be actually the most believable sequence of play that I've seen in a game yet. So I brought this up before as well. When you play a straight I go, you go, usually it feels like, oh look, all my pieces are doing everything and you can't do shit to them. Or maybe you have reaction rolls or something. But it always feels a little false. When you play a truly like pulsed system, Vietnam's an example of that, but Vietnam's got kind of a strange level. Think Korean War by Victory Games as well. Where one side gets to move a few pieces, then the other side gets to move a few pieces. It again feels like this weird sort of I go, you go, and chit pulls are the same kind of thing. I consider them in that interleaved. The CDGs are in that same kind of state where, wow, there's a couple units doing big stuff, and then a couple units on the other side do big stuff, and when what's really happening is everybody's moving at the same time, right? It's all simultaneous. Well, how do you abstract away that simultaneity? How do you get rid of that? Because that's hard to play, yet not lose the effects of it. And this actually does a pretty good job of lots of movement points in your own turn, less movement points in the opponent's turn, your reaction for that. And that less movement points is basically enough to move a hex to reinforce. What that does is it makes reserves really important in this game in a way that in so many games they just are not. Now, reserves are important in the OCS, but you have to specifically designate them, and I guess you kind of do here, but it feels kind of, you have a limited number of such designations in OCS, and it feels like you're taking an extra step somehow. It may just be my psychology. Okay, so there are a couple of places in each player turn where both people are doing stuff, but for the most part only one person is doing things. And the first thing is the player, gets their reinforcements, whatever. Then you do a little bit more bookkeeping that's joint. And then you go back to the player whose turn it is, and they designate which corps, what their corps and army boundaries are. Army boundaries are kind of absolute, but they can be jagged. Corps boundaries are not geographical. You assign units to the corps using those little cards that you have. Now it's important because you can only do this at the beginning of your own turn, which means if you launch an attack with your corps, or with multiple corps, you might end up pushing the enemy out, or getting knocked back or whatever, but you may end up disrupting your initial setup to a degree where one of your defensive locations that's key to you is not easily supported because it's adjacent to reserves of the wrong corps or whatever. And this is kind of the one facet of this whole corps system that actually does something. Now you're paying a lot for that. You really are. And I can think of some abstractions that will weaken the historicity of how this works. But basically, on your own turn, you can redesign your core pretty much at will. There are some specifically designated divisions which belong to specific core, and they can never be moved out. But you basically have enough loose pieces that you can shade around and make things work. Unfortunately, the cost of that particular aspect of the game is just too high on me. Even though it seems to get things very, very right. In fact, everything in this game seems to be designed with the idea towards a heightened historicity with the burden, because they didn't want to make it in complex rules, being on the mechanical actions that the players have to take. You may get used to them. I'm not sure. You certainly could get used to more complex rules, but they provide a barrier to entry. But I found that the mechanical aspects to this provided at least as high a barrier. Okay, then you trace supply, and basically each army and corps have their own supply depots. The army depots have to move along rail lines, and then they can supply the corps depots, and the corps depots can supply, well, both can supply individual units. Corps can only supply their own units. You have the capacity to extend the range of where you can throw your supply to. Doing that comes at a cost, though. It means that you're expending so much effort on transporting supplies that you can transport less supplies. You basically have an unlimited capacity. You can supply all your units for all their combats during a turn, as long as your units are not extended. But if you extend your supply ranges, you have a limitation on each supply unit as to how many formations that it can supply. We gotta swap batteries. Okay. And while there's nothing too exciting about that, it works pretty well. And it's probably mechanically easier than the OCS shuffling all these different, supply points around, which are already an abstraction, so, I don't know how important they are. I found the depots worked pretty damn well. Pretty damn limiting, though. You don't have the capacity that you have in OCS to push your supplies through, even where it would be really hard to do so. But that's okay. Because in almost all cases, the supplies that you need for a force would be able to get through. It's just, in things like Burma in OCS, it works pretty nicely. You've got your elephants and donkeys and stuff carrying supplies through paths that are just, a system like this could not handle that. But this being Europe, you're not having that kind of, you don't need that kind of general complexity in place, I think. And, given that OCS's roots are in the Big East Front battles of World War II, it's kind of surprising that the supply rules that they had were used, but, I think the idea was to extend to North Africa and stuff, and it does get more complicated now. Okay, movement. So movement's kind of funky in this. Like I said, you get more movement points on your own turn. In this case, everything gets 9 movement points, and everything moves pretty much the same. You have some force march capability. I shied away from it because it has a chance of degrading your units in terms of their combat effectiveness, call it morale, whatever. I'm very, very shy of reducing my capabilities overly so. Yeah, battery wasn't charging. You get used to that with my bits. Then the non-phasing player gets their counter movement phase, and they only get 5 movement points, but they have the same capacity to force march, which could be very valuable. I tended not to do it because the combat doesn't tend to be too bloody. I had one really, really bloody combat die roll in the game. In general, it's more of an attritional type combat system. You're not seeing big forces getting wiped out or anything. You're seeing them getting degraded, and there's a constant resupply, supply of reinforcements coming in, and then there's also additional boosts of reinforcements that you get during the interphases. Okay. Then the phasing player is allowed to launch attacks. Now, like I said, you've got this multi-die roll situation, and you've got a fair number of factors affecting stuff. First of all, you have the complexity of the odds chart, which sets up odds numbers like 3 to 2, but then sets the barriers not at 1.5 to 2, but rather at 1.25 to 1.74, midway between where the odds chart would be normally. That is something straight out of OCS, as is kind of this complex style of combat chart. This doesn't have as many complex rules, it doesn't have surprise and all kind of stuff like that. But it does have proficiency ratings. And honestly, OCS may use lower valued proficiency is better. I kind of remember it doing so. But it threw me for a loop here, for whatever reason. Not meeting expectations. I haven't played an OCS for a few years, and haven't played one where I was really, really in depth in it for quite some time. Probably back since Burma. Which was long, long ago. Because reluctant enemies, like I said, I may not have gotten into the system with that. Okay. So anyway, there's the difficulty. You have to have a calculator to figure out your odds. You're counting up a fair amount of factors. Artillery in this game serves a very specific, weird function. It affects what I'm going to call your morale roll at the end of combat. And that is the only thing it does. But that can degrade your forces significantly. What you're trying to do on this is not really cause casualties for the most part. In general, what you're trying to do is get a big number on the enemy in order to modify their morale check, if we want to call it that. Degradation check is more like it. You're trying to get one of these black circled retreat markers on the defender to force them out of a space. You have options that I didn't use very much, which is to intensify the battle as either the attacker or the defender. Basically, the defender can say, oh no, I don't want to leave. Or the attacker can say, oh yes, I do want you to leave. And basically, in both cases, you're trading off extended casualties on many die rolls in exchange for either more vigor in pushing the enemy out of the hex, or more vigor in standing and not giving up the hex. I generally didn't find territory that important. That's probably a mistake, because again, the casualties don't really accrue here. Most of them are abstracted away in those CER values. The terrain chart is fairly complicated. Now, like I said, mountains add to your strength points, but other things give you column shifts in combat. Other terrain do, like rivers and such. Elevation levels. Probably forgot about them in a lot of cases. Yeah, I made a lot of mistakes. So you've got kind of this mixture of things, and also the attacker can improve their odds through a couple of means. One is by making a prepared assault. They can only do this during their own player turn, by spending some extra movement points. That freezes the defender in place more or less, and gives them a column shift. They can get 2 column shifts off of an outflank. This is really hard to do. Basically, you have to cover 5 of the surrounding hex sides. They could have a way out that's protected by another friendly unit, with any unit or the zones of control of units involved in the attack. And remember, what this means is other core can't just kind of give you a zone of control to help you. Other core can protect the hex that they're in and help you outflank that way. They can't be involved in the combat, though, so they're not able to project their zone of control for the flanking. And it creates this interesting dynamic where you have less coordination, essentially, between core on the attacks. Much less than you would expect. Well, after you get your result, what you're going to get is possible strength losses, possible retreat values, but most likely just a modifier to your morale check. And both sides make morale checks for each of their stacks, and the amount of artillery involved to the size of the stack, it's not based on density here. The bigger the stack, the less affected by artillery it is. It changes that modifier. You make a simple die roll, and you're trying to meet less than or equal to the CER level of the force. Now that CER level goes down as the force loses quality, and if you exceed that CER level, you cause more hits to the CER level. Okay. Those numbers are fairly large, though, like 10 for the Austrians and 11 for the Serbs. And okay. Once you take more than 3 of those CER hits, though, you start losing more than just your capacity to stand in line and fight. Eventually, you become combat ineffective, where, I don't remember, there's more limitations on what you can do. I think you're still allowed to attack. And then you become disorganized, which you can't even attack with, and stuff like that. Very small units have a special little rule here. I don't think I had any fights between them, but the game is kind of set up so that there probably should be in the mountains. I just didn't do it. Let me look over these other things. Yeah. So everything is using the same movement points in the movement phases, and the same movement point costs. This is kind of weird. But it works. It works. Cav can press their movement by force marching further than infantry can. But I didn't like force marching, so we didn't see much of that. After the phasing player gets to do his combat, then the non-phasing player gets to do an equivalent set of combat. They cannot declare prepared assaults during their movement phase, during their counter movement or whatever. So they will not get that column shift. There's also a little bit of combat. Normally you'd see this as overruns. It's not. It's called repulses or something along those lines, where you can do a combat against someone to try to knock them out of a hex. You need fairly high odds for this to work at all, and I only saw it very early in the game. Okay, and then at the end, okay, here's one of the cute little things. Your cav, this is a joint phase. Both players' cav can pull out of zones of control a little cheaper than they could during their movement phase. And this is where this weird dance comes. It's one of the many cases where you're doing some mechanical stuff to avoid putting more complex rules into play. There's only one cav unit in the game. I don't care too much about that there. I'm much more concerned about the course facets. But, there's a fair amount of cav on the East Front, and I could see it getting kind of cumbersome there. When you cross rivers without bridges, and most of the rivers start out on bridge, you have pontoon bridges, though, that you can use, your units get penalized. They get penalized during your turn, And so on your combat or your opponent's counter attacks, they're weak. In between player turns, they strengthen a little bit, and then they fully strengthen at the end of the enemy player turn. So when the enemy really has a chance to react with their full movement point allowance set up, maybe do a prepared assault and everything, you're partially recovered from your river crossing. But if they've got a nice cordon in place, they could conceivably launch an attack against you right as you're crossing, and then perhaps screwed. And that's really about it. There's a few other little pieces that I haven't talked about. You have some entrenchments, improved positions. Those are with a column shift. You're limited to how many you can put down in each period of the game. You collect them up at the beginning of the game. You can't have any. I think I cheated there. 2 hex units allow you to spread out a little bit more to cover more ground, probably defensively when facing not overwhelming enemy odds. Let's look at the special rules because that's where a lot of the cute stuff is. So the Serbs have some special little defensive markers they can move around that help a little bit. They have to track their artillery, and this was beginning to look like a serious problem for them towards, I was barely halfway through the game, and they were down to less than a fifth their total artillery that they had, so you can burn through it too quickly. And if they run out of artillery shells, they can no longer use artillery, which means they're really not going to hurt the enemy. They may be able to still hold their ground, but they're not going to do much damage to the enemy. They're not going to make them pay a price for their attacks to the same level. Special rules for garrisons, fortresses, stuff like that, that are really just little chromey type things. Montenegrins have their own little reinforcement thing. Naval squadrons, basically artillery on the river, with a whole bunch of special rules to deal with that. Okay. One of the biggies, though, is the idea of strategic plans. The commanders of the various armies come into a scenario with pre-planned objectives. Now, this is a really kind of weird thing. You are not allowed the kind of flexibility that... in some games, you're just flexible all over the fucking place, right? Here, they kind of give you this map of like 3 or 4 hexes that you always have to be moving towards. And they're kind of spaced out. So you can kind of triangulate among them. The problem is, you can't make what I would consider a tactical or operational decision to recover under some circumstances, because you have to be far from the enemy to recover. So you can't pull units out of the line to do that, and I kind of cheated with that unintentionally. I'm not sure how valid that is historically. Certainly in other campaigns, units were pulled back and allowed to recover during an operation when maybe they shouldn't have been able to. You might also be able to fudge things around by moving something to another army, as long as it's still in supply, that isn't under your particular operational concerns. And yeah. I could see, I might have gotten away with some of the stuff I did with the 5th Army in my game by shifting stuff to the 2nd Army while it was still there, or to the army group or whatever. It would have still been in supply. It would have been able to fall back because it wasn't under command restrictions. But you can't do that with the core integral units, which, unless you move the core to another army, which you can also do. There's nothing that limits the core and says they have to stay with a given army. So there's probably flexibility to basically ignore these strategic plans, but you have to be kind of clever to do it and kind of rules lawyerish. I feel like the way the rules are written, they will survive rules lawyers, and it may be necessary to be a rules lawyer to play the game with the flexibility needed. To mimic historical situations. Anyway, you can eventually abandon a strategic plan, but there's a penalty in victory points. So, I mean, if you can possibly succeed in it, you want to. Historically, the Austrians abandoned their big strategic plan and shifted their armies about. And victory points are off of capturing specific hexes, holding hexes throughout the game, and furthest advance that the Austrians have, plus the strategic plan abandonment. Now, I found that the Serbs had a really hard time constraining the Austrians. On the other hand, I cheated in favor of the Austrians, unintentionally, but all the same, I made rules errors that favored the Austrians. However, I'm not convinced that those errors were sufficient to make this a situation where the Austrians could have been stopped from getting their victory conditions. Looking at it, if I was playing the situation that I was facing, I would do much the same. The Austrians would have less victory points and less of an advantage, but they basically won by a complete blowout in terms of victory points. And there was really nothing the Serbs could do to stop them. I don't think, my gut feeling says that you're not going to get the historical situation where the Austrians are forced to abandon the Fifth Army plan completely and go defend the other side of within Austria itself against Serbian advances. I just don't see that, and I certainly don't see that they take Belgrade and then have to abandon it. I don't see that either, which also historically happened within the course of the campaign. So I'm very disturbed by at least that impression that I have, that there's all this attempt at creating historically believable subsystems, but I'm not convinced that you would get a historically believable result. Whereas probably from a simpler system, I'm told, the old Great War in the East, it had a Serbian scenario to it. I'm told that that represents things just as well as this. Well, I hope not just as well, at least not just as well as my interpretation. Of course, with these more complex games, that is often the case. Getting correct subsystems and smaller pieces that all work together and seem to present this detailed, accurate view, sometimes all falls together to give you something that it's unlikely or maybe even impossible to get to the historical results of the campaign. It's just the way the wheels don't quite mesh together in things. I can't guarantee it with this. Again, I did make a couple of major situations where I was cheating in favor of the Austrians. The most notable was on the combat chart. I basically gave the Austrians the better proficiency by reversing the order of adding and subtracting. That's a line in the rules and not intuitive from the combat chart. There's no mention, if I recall correctly, on the combat chart. I'm not sure it would help me. There's a lot of clutter on that chart. But I certainly would have, again, I probably didn't approach it carefully enough, but my impression was positive, good, negative, bad. Well, that was the wrong impression on the combat chart. A little bit of study would have fixed that. Just like paying more attention to the terrain would have kept me from failing as badly as I did there. I've gotten sloppier. There's no question about that. Overall, my feelings. There are some things that I really think that it does very, very well. Most of the game systems, subsystems feel good. Feel a level of detail that I should love. The amount of effort involved in maintaining the core boundaries, distinctions, was the biggest killer for me. And then maybe most of the rest of it. Some of it is the situation. I don't think the situation in the game is the most interesting to play out. I think that the other games in the series, which are much, much larger, and that's one of the reasons I went for this, are more interesting situations. I mean, you think Schlieffen Plain, you're thinking a lot of movement there. You're thinking the battles in Galicia or in Tannenberg area. You're thinking a lot of room for maneuver and trying to degrade positions. There was actually a fair amount of maneuver, especially in the south in the mountains. But most of that was probably from me misreading the map, rather than like, oh, I can defend here. This is, the forces I'm going to allocate to it. I'm good. I just kept making mistakes on one side or the other in terms of what can I hold, what can't I. And again, there's something about those maps that was not intuitive to me and very, very disturbing in that sense. And I kind of worry that, the other ones won't be any easier. They'll just be bigger places for me to make more errors in terms of being able to read maps. Again, that's a matter of getting used to them. You get used to how the terrain is. Maybe a little better light would have helped. My lighting here is not great. But whatever. Those shades between the mountains were not, people make fun of the garish maps of the 1980s, but at least you could distinguish one terrain type from the other. Here, essentially, the different mountain types all just kind of blurred together because they're close in color. I can tell this one's different from this, with everything except the gray and the tan of rough. The gray of uplands and the tan of rough. Those I had difficulty in. I think that was my light. I think brighter and better lights would have helped. But I don't have that anywhere in my house. But what I couldn't tell, wow, my spare battery is charged full. How'd that happen? What I couldn't tell is whether I'm looking at a high mountain or a low mountain without searching all around the board. Okay, this is definitely a high mountain. Well, then this one. And then I have to trace it all the way over to follow the color paths and see, just because, again, my lighting, my eyes, whatever, are not what they used to be. But it was not easy to find that. Now, is that a big deal if you fuck it up? No, I made much, much bigger fuck ups than that. So, I'm not going to grouse too much about it. But yeah, overall, I found the burden was just too great for what I was getting out of the game. It ended up a very static situation, one where I didn't see much capability for change from the lines that were beginning to, that formed midway, maybe 6 turns into the game, 10 turns into the game, whatever. And I got about 20 turns in of a 40-turn game or whatever. More than 20, I think. I don't know. Anyway, I was just looking at, this continuing slow pushing the Serbians further and further back because they didn't have the resources. They don't get the resources that the Austrians do, and there just were not opportunities. The Austrians had all the edge, as far as I could see it. Um, and that's with me firing too many shells off with the Serbs already, where I was going to run out of ammunition and not be able to defend myself even as effectively as I had been able to up to that point. And I was going to have to start taking reductions, and eventually probably I would run out and just be really kind of screwed. So yeah, I really not sure how I see that the game would give you the historical results very likely. Let's send this one up.